So, our speaker now, I'm happy to welcome Joana Rigato, who comes from Portugal. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Champalimaud Research Institute. So, is it Champalimaud is the
research? Yeah.
Yeah, and where she is currently working with a team of neuroscientists on the role of first-person experience in science. And she earned her PhD in History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Lisbon with a dissertation entitled The Possibility of Reaction, where she develops and defends a scientifically plausible agent-causal libertarian position. And I think this is also what she's going to talk to us about presently. She will present a talk entitled Agent-Causation and Supervenience, how you can have one without giving up the other.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here. Well, I'm not going to be as ambitious today as I was in my dissertation. I'm just going to present a much smaller portion of my work. So I'm going to present to you my idea on how agent causation and supervenience are compatible, which I believe it's very important for the agent causalist if she wants to be to have a stronger position in the debate. So I'm going to start just by framing the problem. We have different questions on the debate of free will. Of course, we have the question that is most usually debated: can an agent decide and act freely in a deterministic world? Answers to this question set the divide between compatibilists and incompatibilists. We've already heard a lot about that yesterday and today. And then there is another question, which I believe is more complicated, and for me it's more important even, which is the question whether an agent can decide and act freely if her thoughts, beliefs, and desires are entirely encoded in her brain. So if the hypothesis of neuroscience is true, that everything that all the psychological level of a human being is encoded in her brain, then can she actually act freely and decide freely? And this question unfolds in two other separate questions or separate lines of research. One is the one concerning the hierarchical relation between the neurobiological and the mental levels, which is a synchronic relation. And this answers to this question have to do with this divide between dualism and monism, emergentism or reductionism. There is a whole spectrum, very broad spectrum of positions that one can take regarding this problem. And then we have the other problem, which is the one regarding the causal relation between an action and its causes. So it has to do with the diachronic relation between the action and what brought it about. And the answers to this question, or to this problem, are what sets the divide between event causalism and agent causalism. So from here, we can see already that I consider that the choice between agent causalism and event causalism is not a choice that only an incompatibilist has to make. Also, one could have a compatibilist answer to the first question and then have an agent causalist question to this problem, to the problem B. And I'm going to show now how I think the agent causalist position should defend its right to be considered seriously, independently from the position we take on the first question. So the big difference between event causalists and agent causalists is this, just very briefly, if anyone is not familiar with this debate. So we could, an event causalist considers that states and events, mental states and events, are what causes a decision or an action to happen. And the agent causalist considers that those states and events belong to a certain agent who, as herself, as a composite entity, is part of the causal etiology of the action. So basically, the states and events are what indirectly causes or indirectly influences the choice that a substance, which is the agent herself, will make. So there is a causal link between that substance and the decision, which is underdetermined by those states and events. Of course, she's influenced by those states. Those states incline her with a certain propensity, with a certain probability towards one choice rather than another, but then the ultimate choice is up to the agent. So agents are different from non-agents, for example, in this way. Let's use the example of the drug addict. I apologize because we all know, or many of us know, that when we talk about the difference between a drug addict and a non-addict in terms of the causal power, the self-control that the non-addict has with respect to the drug addict, we're oversimplifying the subject, the matter, right? So we know that drug addicts probably are not this idealistic drug addict that Frankfurt had designed. But let's imagine, for argument's sake, that we have a drug addict that is so deeply committed to the drug consumption that she does not possess any self-control anymore when she has the craving for the drug, okay? So the difference between these two people is that it's not the reasons to act that one has and the other doesn't. That's not true, because both agents have reasons to act. They have beliefs and desires. The drug addict has the belief that a certain dose will calm the craving that she has, the desire that she has for the drug. The difference, I believe, is what Frankfurt says here, that the addict's desire to take the drug will be effective regardless of whether or not he wants this desire to constitute his will. So basically, the question is that in the drug addict, there is not an agential intervention between the reasons to act and the action itself. So the desires and the beliefs immediately cause the action to happen, independently from what I call an agential intervention, which is an intentional intervention by someone who's the agent, apart from the agent's parts, or even apart from the reasons that compose her state of mind at a certain point in time when she makes the decision. Whereas the non-addict is herself the cause of the action. Of course, this talk is not a defense of agent causalism. I just put here this introduction to show why I believe agent causalism is a position that anyone who's concerned about the agent not being a spectator of action, but an agent and an author of the action should consider seriously. And now, let's see, so the agent is irreducible to the reasons to act. This was clear from before, I just forgot that. I had that arrow there. So the implications of this is that there is a somewhat owner-body distinction in an agent that is at the basis of the action as an intentional execution of the agent's power of self-movement. So this, I'm being influenced by Helen Stewart here. So the action is an intentional execution of a certain power that the agent has to conduct her body in the world, and that power is in the possession of a part of the agent that is irreducible to her states and events. What part is this? I consider that this is an emergent part of the agent, naturally emergent. So the implications of such a contention is that, first, the agent's self, I will call it the self, that emergent part, that irreducible part, must be more than the mereological sum of her mental states and events. And this is what leads the agent causalist to emergentism, or could lead her to Cartesian dualism, for that matter, but that's not my position, because I don't want to get into the problems that Cartesian dualism has. So I prefer an emergentist position. Then the agent's self must have a sort of downward causal power over the goings-on in her mind and brain. Of course, it's not enough to be irreducible. That entity has to have the power to cause events in the world, and, more interestingly, to cause events in that portion of the world that causes her to emerge. So we have the brain that at a certain state of complexity gives rise to a certain emergent ability to act, and according to my account, gives rise to a certain conscious self that has that ability to act. And that brain is itself, in turn, the scenario where that the power of that agent will have repercussions on. So that the brain causes a certain emergent entity to exist, and then that emergent entity will have effects on that brain. That's, of course, apparently paradoxical, and that's the problem that emergentism has to deal with. And then thirdly, actions must be substance caused rather than event caused on this kind of view. I'm not going to discuss this third clause. I will assume that Tim O'Connor and other substance causalists are right and manage to answer to the objections that are put forward against them. And I will focus on the two first implications of an agent causal account. Now, first, let's understand what I intend with emergence as an answer to the first concern of the irreducible self. So ontological emergence is a relation between an upper-level entity and a lower-level entity. And of course, this already makes clear that I'm not talking about epistemological emergence. So I'm not talking about a relation between descriptions, between theories that account for a certain portion of reality. I'm talking about the reality itself independently from the theories we have. Because, I mean, epistemological emergence is uncontroversial. Of course, we have certain theories that are, in certain aspects, are irreducible to other theories that describe a bottom-level reality. So concepts in biology are not entirely reducible to concepts in chemistry, etc. But that's not what concerns me here. So I'm concerned with a relation between, for example, cells and molecules, or between molecules and atoms and subatomic particles, or between the mind and the brain. And so that upper-level entity depends on the lower-level entity in order to exist. It cannot exist without that lower-level entity, and it changes according to the changes of that lower-level entity. But it has new causal powers that are underived from the causal powers of that lower-level entity. And by this, I mean that for an entity to be called emergent, its causal powers cannot be entirely explainable on the basis of the causal powers of the entity below. By explainable, I mean that the sum of the causal powers below and the laws that explain and describe and prescribe the behavior of the parts of the emergent entity are not sufficient to account for what happens at the upper level. So we're not talking about causal powers that we can reduce. We're talking about causal powers that we cannot reduce. And I mean, I'm of course assuming that this is not only an epistemological problem. Okay, so for emergence to exist, this is not only a problem of the epistemic access that we have to those causal powers and those laws and everything that allows us to explain something. Those causal powers also are usually downwardly directed. So the new causal powers of the upper level entity have effects on the lower level entity, like I was saying before. What are the conditions of possibility for this downward causation phenomenon? I believe there are three conditions of possibility. First, the distinctness between the emergent and the emergent base, of course. They cannot be identical and one cannot be reducible to the other. The emergent entity has to have an ontological status that is independent from the status of its parts, their sum, and their relations. They have to be distinct. Second, the causal closure of the physical cannot be entirely true because, and I will now expand on this, if it were true, there would be no logical space for that downward causal powers to actually exist because all the causal effects would be caused by physical states and events and substances, etc. Or, I mean, since I'm assuming a substance causal account by substances. And so these first two clauses are actually very common among emergentists. This is not what I consider to be more interesting of what I'm bringing here today. What I think is more interesting is that I consider that a third clause is that there must be bottom-level indeterminism in order for downward causation to exist. Okay? Let me remind you that I didn't start off with an incompatibilist position. I consider that independently from the answer we give to the question of the compatibility between indeterminism and free will, we, just as non-reductionists, if we were to follow the argument that I very briefly stated here in favor of agent causation, we would have to defend the possibility for downward causation in the world, and now I'm going to try to show you that this in turn will lead us to defend that there must be bottom level indeterminism. The first clause, distinctness. This one I think is not very complicated, and I'm not going to expand very much on this. I believe that when we're talking about the relation between the mind and the brain, we are talking about the relation between two things that are totally incommensurable and irreducible one to another. Because I'm concerned not about the mind overall, but I'm concerned about the conscious portion of the mind, which is something that exists in the world that everybody has a direct evidence of, and which is something that is totally distinct from anything else that exists in the world, which is a subjective experience that each one has. So the phenomenal experience that endows us with a first-person perspective on the world is something that is radically distinct from anything else that ever existed before a conscious entity appeared on Earth. A stone, an atom, a chair, they're all somehow comparable, and I believe also a living entity and the non-living entity are comparable because a living entity such as a cell can be described in terms of structure and function, etc. But when a multicellular organism certainly starts having a first-person perspective on the world, then we had a radically different type of jump, type of distinction that I think justifies the idea that we have not a big problem defending that the conscious self is distinct from its body, and so that we can meet this clause on in what concerns the conditions of possibility for downward causation. There have been numerous arguments in favor of this. I'm not going to go into this. We have the bat, Nagel's bat. We have Mary, the black and white neuroscientist. And I think I'm not going to go into this. This is not the subject of my talk. I mean, not the main subject of my talk. So this is just to resume what I want to say, to summarize what I want to say. Causal reducibility, which is something I'm not questioning. So I'm not questioning that maybe future neuroscience will be able to explain causally how it is that the brain gives rise to the conscious experience. This is not something that I'm questioning, but that causal reducibility will never amount to ontological reducibility. Okay? And Searle has a very good argument in favor of this. Now, the causal closure of the physical. This, I think, is more interesting. This is a principle that claims that for every physical event or its chances, depending on whether we're talking about a deterministically caused event or an indeterministically caused event, there is a sufficient physical cause insofar as there is any cause at all. So this is the principle of the causal closure of the physical, which naturally has an implication that forces us into making a choice. Either the two things that we're talking, the two levels that we're discussing. Right now I'm discussing the psychological, the conscious level, as opposed to the non-conscious level. Either they're not distinct after all, or the conscious level is epiphenomenal. Because if every physical event has to be a physical cause, then the non-physical causes are either false causes, illusory causes, so they're epiphenomenal, or they can actually reduce to the physical causes. Maybe the physical is identical to the non-physical, or the non-physical is identical to the physical. That's actually what I wanted to say. But you may be guessing that this is a bit ambiguous. What do we mean by physical here, right? So there are two senses in which we can interpret the causal closure of the physical. We can interpret it as the causal closure of the microphysical, in which we intend the physical as opposed to the chemical, the biological, the psychological, the social, etc. So the physical as what is studied by physical science. And this would mean that any microphysical event, insofar as it has a physical cause, it has a microphysical cause. Or we can intend it as the causal closure of the material, and I'm sorry for this word, it's not the best word because it already pushes us toward lots of questions what is matter, etc. But I didn't find a better word for this. I intend the causal closure of the physical as anything that can be studied by any natural science. So the physical as the microphysical plus the chemical, the biological, etc. So all the portions of matter that can be quantified, detected by our senses or by our measuring devices, all that as opposed to the mental. This is what is usually discussed in philosophy of mind, whereas the first version of the causal closure is what is usually studied in philosophy of science. But I prefer, instead of putting the mental there, I prefer to put the conscious there, because I think I have no problem with considering that the non-conscious operations of our mind may be identical to their neural substrates. I have no problem with that. The problem is that the conscious parts of our activity, of our mental activity, be reducible to their neural substrates. Okay? So now the causal closure of the physical is something that I'm also not very concerned about, because it is not something that we have any proof of. Physics itself does not imply its own causal closure, nor is there any proof within physics of its own completeness. I'm quoting Robert Bishop here. So the causal closure of the physical is a metaphysical assumption that we use in order to defend physicalism. It's a metaphysical assumption that we use in order to extrapolate from the results we have from our scientific experiments into generalizations about how the world is like. But it's not a scientific truth. It's not something that a scientist can assume to be true as a scientist. He can assume it personally, at a personal level. Okay? And so what we know, what science tells us, is that typically physical causes produce physical events. Under controlled conditions, when we're trying to figure out what is the cause of a certain event in the world, we program a certain experiment under certain conditions in a certain type of room in order to prevent non-physical causes to intervene. And for example, in what concerns microphysical experiment, we're going to try to isolate the initial conditions that we're testing from any other sort of interference, and then we can actually verify that physical causes produce physical effects. But that's very different from asserting that all causes have to be physical causes. This is something that is only a metaphysical assumption that someone could eventually endorse, and many people do, but they cannot say that this is something we can be certain about. So if we have good reasons for questioning this, for example, depending on our phenomenological experience of free will and of mental causation, for example, then we may as well just contend that the causal closure of the physical is not true. And also, I want to highlight that even if reductionism were true of the whole non-conscious domain, what I call the material domain, still the irreducibility, the radical, I'm sorry for saying irreducibility, I want to say that the radical discontinuity, the radical distinctness between phenomenal experience and the objective brain and body could give us good reason to think that at a certain point in the scale of complexity of nature, the break of causal closure could happen. For example, I personally tend to believe that reductionism is true of all the material world. I have a lot of problems understanding when emergentists tell me that the biologically does have causal power that is irreducible to the causal powers of the parts that constitute organisms. So I'm not saying that this is not true. I've discussed this with very serious condensed matter physicists, for example, that defend that emergentism is true. But what I've realized so far is that the only thing that we have evidence of is of a very persistent epistemological emergentism in physics, for example, in condensed matter physics, unlike what is usually said, that physics would be a portion of science that proves to us that reductionism is true. That is not true. Particle physics maybe, other parts of physics they don't, and most condensed matter physicists are actually reductionists. But what they are discussing about and all the examples they give to me only show that epistemological emergence is actually very, very strong. And there is no reduction of particle physics to quantum mechanics, for example, with all the other levels in between. But in what concerns ontological emergence, I believe that we should be very cautious in contending that that is how the world works from the conscious level downwards. But from the conscious level up, or what I mean is from the neurobiological level up, I believe that we have a radical discontinuity that allows us to infer that maybe there's some radical novelty, which is the ability from the conscious levels to have downward effects on the bottom level. Now, emergent dualism, and I'm using the word dualism, and so usually people I lose most of my audience here, but I hope you won't be so afraid of that word. Emergent dualism is just a combination of emergentism with the specific case of the relation between the conscious mind and the brain. That's all it is. It's a contention that the conscious self is distinct from its body. It can affect its body intentionally, but it emerges from the body naturally and is dependent on the body throughout life. This is the only thing that I'm defending when I talk about emergent dualism, or when I endorse emergent dualism. Okay, so it's the combination between the distinction clause, the downward causation clause, with the idea that emergence is something that happens naturally, that there are laws that make it so that when a certain brain achieves a certain state of complexity, something will emerge that is conscious, and the dependency condition. Now, the problem now is that we can't have it all. Just as we can't keep the causal closure of the physical and drop the causal closure of the physical, we have to keep one. Just as if we keep the causal closure of the physical, we have to drop the distinctness condition, or we have to drop the idea that the conscious has causal effects in the world, so we have to pick one. Same-wise, even if the causal closure of the physical breaks, we have to pick one between supervenience and bottom-level indeterminism. Okay? Because even if the causal closure of the physical breaks, it's not easy to explain how it is that an emergent entity could have downward effects on the world. And I'm going now to expand on this, and this is my main claim today. This problem of that alternative has to do with the exclusion problem, or the supervenience problem, as Kim called it. And when Kim is explaining that problem, he cites Jonathan Edwards on this quote: "The images of things in a glass, as we keep our eyes upon them, seem to remain precisely the same, with a continuing perfect identity. But it is known to be otherwise. These images are constantly renewed by the impression and reflection of new rays of light, so that the image impressed by the former rays is constantly vanishing, and a new image is impressed by new rays every moment, both on the glass and on the eye. The image that exists at this moment is not at all derived from the image which existed at the last preceding moment." So he's using this beautiful metaphor, I believe, of the rays of light, which gives us a certain image on a glass, to show that you cannot have diachronic causation and synchronic determination at the same time. If the rays of light are what causes the image to exist at every single instant, then the preceding image is not the cause of the ensuing image. And this is just a metaphor to show that we cannot have this at the level of agent causings. The supervenience of the mind on the brain, what does it mean? For me to be very clear on the concept. There is no mental change without a corresponding physical change. And I'm talking about supervenience as a covariance relation that is asymmetric. Okay? This is what I mean. It's the type of supervenience that I'm concerned with. The dependency, in what concerns the changes, the dependency of the mental on the physical. The mental, including the conscious and the unconscious. Okay? Now, if we want to keep this supervenience, then we have that synchronic determination, bottom-up determination, that Kim was concerned about, and which, according to him, would prevent a diachronic causation happening at the level of the mental. But is supervenience really the problem? I believe it's not. And if we go and see exactly the explanation that Kim gives, I think we will see why. he says, no single event can have more than one sufficient cause occurring at any given time unless it is a genuine case of causal overdetermination. For sure, you have seen here what I'm saying also, the sufficiency condition that is here. So he says, no event can have more than one sufficient cause. Of course, but there are events that don't have sufficient causes. Okay, let's look at this here. This is where I'm agreeing with Kim. So we have a certain structure, hierarchical structure at time t1. We have an A level that we could imagine to be the quantum level, the B level and the C level, respectively the molecular and the cellular level. But we could think of different levels that are related in a similar fashion. And we have a deterministic causal link between A1 and A2 at time t2. So at time t2, there was an evolution of the whole system that was determined to be as it is from the bottom level up, because A1 determines A2 to be as it is, and we have a supervenience relation that makes it so that the evolution at the B level and the C level is happening according to a certain evolution at the bottom level. So the possibility for B1 to cause events at T2, both at the level B or at the A level, is absent because it would be a redundant form of causation. But if there were to be an indeterministic causal link between the structure at T1 and two alternative possible structures at T2, then things would be different. Because from given A at T1, we have two possible states in which the quantum level can be at T2, either A1 or A2. And that supervenience causal link can still assure that the structure 1 happens rather than the structure 2, or alternative, the structure 2 rather than the structure 1. So B1 and B2 are respectively determined by A1 and A2. But still, at the D level, which is the level of the conscious domain in this schema, we could have an entity that can be a joint cause of which of the two structures becomes actual. So without the intervention of D, the selection between A1 or A2 would be totally chancy. Because given A, we have two possible effects. This is the definition of an indeterministic cause. Given that cause, we have two alternative effects in the world. Each one has a given probability of happening. Maybe one has 30%, the other one has 70%. They are both caused by A. Like Tim said this morning, it's not true that they don't have a cause. They do have a cause. Without A, none of them would happen. But given A, either of them is possible. But given D, one of them becomes actual because given those two causes, then that one has a higher probability of happening. Okay? It's still not determined, but D was what tipped the balance towards in one direction rather than another. D is also an indeterministic cause, okay? D is not determined to choose A1 rather than A2, but it is the one which tipped the balance in one direction rather than the other. Why should one hold on to supervenience, though, you might ask? Why are you trying to assert that the world must be indeterministic rather than just accept that maybe supervenience does not hold? This would imply, though, that indeterminism could be, for example, an emergent feature of reality. This is what certain incompatibilists defend, that we should not be too concerned about what happens at the bottommost level, because maybe indeterminism is an emergent feature of reality. We would have emergent indeterminism. I don't think that's a concern of the majority of people in this room, but I wanted to address that because I found it very interesting that in the literature on emergentism and on free will, very few authors specify whether they consider that indeterminism has to start from the bottom up. Very few authors are specific on this, which I find very interesting because if indeterminism could be something that appears only at a certain level of reality, libertarians wouldn't have half the problems that they have because they wouldn't have to speculate about the physical nature of the world, right? But this is something that very few authors are explicit about. And I want to explicitly address this concern. So let's imagine that we have a structure that could have, for example, a composition relation between the level A to the level B or C. Okay, so A are parts of B, B are parts of C. And there is a deterministic causal link between A and A star. And only at the level B, or C or E, we can imagine any level, an indeterministic part of reality appears. By this I mean that given B, B1 and B2 are both possible. But at the bottom level, determinism holds. But this means that we have to find a different type of relation between A star and the two B's. It cannot be a composition relation because, of course, A star cannot compose B1 and at the same time for it to be possible to compose B2. Okay, either one. So let's imagine this is an indeterministic causal relation because this is the type of relation that is indeterministic, right? So we would have a branching type of reality in which at a certain time t2, given the precedent state of the world at t1, only A star is possible, but different states at level B or level C are possible. Well, could the reality be like this? Looking at it, at the image like this, it seems a bit strange, right? But it's not that strange if we look at what certain authors have said. For example, Elizabeth Anstrom, in her very, very, very influential article, used the image of chess. I don't know if you remember. In relation to the solar system, she says, the laws are like the rules of an infantile card game. And by this, she means a card game in which, given the initial conditions of the game, you already can predict what will happen. There are not alternatives, given the rules and the initial conditions. But in relation to what happens on and inside a planet, the laws are rather like the rules of chess. The play is seldom determined, though nobody breaks the rules. So this is a beautiful image. And we could imagine the world of free agents to be like this. So we have only a handful of laws, and it's totally unpredictable how the game will unfold. This is what happens apparently with chess. With soccer, it's the same thing. Well, I believe this is actually a very fallacious image. Because if we're comparing chess or soccer to what happens inside an organism, we're comparing to incommensurable descriptions of a system. Of course, if we're thinking that chess is a game where the play is not determined, though nobody breaks the rules, we're only talking about a very coarse-grained description of the game. We're only talking about the rules that we know, the rules that are explicit. We're not talking about the laws of nature. We're not talking about the description of the system where each particle has a role. So if we would be the Laplacian demon describing a certain room where two players are playing chess, and if the world were deterministic, we would be able to predict the evolution of the game. So this is a coarse-grained description that we cannot compare with the types of schemas that I was using before, in which I'm talking about what happens at the quantum level with a complete description of the system at the quantum level and all the other levels, okay? So I don't think that that type of world, this one, is plausible, and also not only because the quote, for example, by Anscombe, I think is actually not well put, but also because we've had numerous reasons in the last century's science to believe in supervenience. Like the developments we've had in particle physics, in molecular biology, in neuroscience, are all based on the assumption of supervenience. We have certain change as a certain level of reality that it can observe, and we make inferences about the lower level changes that are happening, and then we go and check those lower level changes. We make experiments in which we can manipulate reality by turning on and off certain things at the bottom level and seeing what happens at the upper level part of reality. And this is also what educated people do normally in their daily basis, in their daily lives. For example, imagine we put 2 glasses of milk in the fridge. The 2 glasses come from the same pack with the same expiration date. And then in one of the glasses, the milk gets spoiled, in the other it doesn't. We will infer that there must be some micro level cause, some invisible cause that made it so that one milk got spoiled rather than the other. So the differences that we observe at the macro level lead us to inferences about what is happening at the micro level. And this is not only in what concerns glasses of milk, but I believe, or at least in my opinion, also in what concerns at the psychological level. Okay, so some changes at the psychological level are due to changes at the neurological level. Okay, but I believe that supervenience does not exclude the possibility for downward causation. So this is, oh, sorry, I had an extra slide before my last slide, in which I just wanted to also say that one could say, okay, but you are inferring that there is indeterminism, and we're talking about neuronal indeterminism, which is not as easy as just talking about quantum indeterminacy, that we know that at the quantum level, the most mainstream interpretation of quantum mechanics is indeterministic. Many will say, well, this is not the kind of indeterminism you want. You want an indeterminism in the brain that has effects at the level of synapses. And that's highly implausible because we're talking about a very big system, wet and warm, where the quantum effects are washed out. I just wanted to say that this is not consensual, that most of the neuroscientists I know are agnostic about the indeterminacy in the brain. They say that the neural processes that we observe and study in the brain are stochastic, they're only probabilistic, and most of the neuroscientists don't know and are agnostic about whether those probabilistic processes at the neural level are caused by indeterminacies at the bottom level, or it is only that we don't yet know what causes them at a one-to-one basis, not statistically, okay? So this is something that is still under discussion in neuroscientists, but there are certain neuroscientists that have already claimed explicitly that they endorse an indeterministic view about the brain, whether, according to which the behavioral indeterminacy that we can observe, not only in people, but in flies, for example, is caused by random events in the cell, which in turn are caused by interactions at the atomic level, many of which are governed by quantum physics and thus are truly indeterminate events. I've found several authors that defend this. The one I'm quoting here is Paul Glimcher, who says, in a conclusion of an article that he has about indeterminacy in the brain, he says, physical indeterminacy seems to be a fundamental property of the brain. Of course, I'm not saying it is. I'm saying that it's wrong when people criticize libertarians or anyone that defends that there is indeterminacy in the brain by saying this is scientifically implausible, this is true, this is false, you're just contradicting what our current best science tells us. Now, to conclude, this is my model, okay? So we have different domains. Here I'm concerned about the neural domain. Of course, we know that the decision-making happens in an embodied brain. It's not only something that concerns the mind and the brain. We're talking about the whole body. But for simplicity's sake, let's talk about the neural domain as opposed to the conscious domain. And we have that the neural domain has different levels that are connected by a bottom-up determination relation and that abound the principle of supervenience, which is a logical principle of covariance. Okay, that bottom-up determination relation, we can think of it as a composition relation, for example. And then from the level B, the biochemical level, I changed the numbers here, the letters here, please don't be confused, because now I was more specific. I called the bottom level the level Q because it's a quantum level, then the level C, chemical level, and the level B, biological level. From the biological level up, we have that qualitative jump when consciousness happens, when consciousness appears. And now we have an emergence relation. It's a new type of relation, okay? But I don't think it's spooky. because it's something that is natural. The only difference between this relation and the others is that the new emergent entity has causal powers that are irreducible to the causal powers below. But it's something that naturally appears in the world. And the problem of the appearance of consciousness, as you know, is an open problem. It's a big mystery, both for philosophers and for scientists. So this emergence relation between the biochemical level and the conscious domain here leads to what I call the self. When I'm talking about the self, I'm not talking about a fixed entity with no structure. It has a structure. You can see there MA, MB, MN. Those are different mental states that are part of the self at any given state. They are evolving. They're always evolving. This is a dynamical entity that has some sort of unity that is conferred to it by its first-person perspective on the world, which is unified, but it still has, it's very complex psychologically speaking. Those different mental states influence the decision of the self, and they are correlated with the different neural states at any given instant. But then that self, being an indeterministic cause, can go either way. And when it goes either way, it causes the structure 1 to happen rather than the structure 2, for example, or vice versa. So it has downward causal influences in the world. And by this, it can act and have real effects on the world. And this does not contradict the laws of nature, because the laws of nature, being indeterministic, leave it open which of the two alternatives will become actual. And supervenience is true of all these levels, because at each given instant, the bottom-up consequences are still true. So the self one is conditioned by all that structure, all that hierarchical complex structure that goes from the chemical from the quantum to the chemical to the biochemical level. Thank you very much.